I'm using this post to chronicle the events of this evening, as they have been truly fascinating. Some quick backstory. The small section of the city where me and my friends live is generally known to be haunted, and even if you're not a believer in the supernatural, it's at least a bit eerie. I'm not going to dox myself by stating the location, but let's just say that creepy sightings and murders or deaths due to unexplainable circumstances are our bread and butter. For most people, this means you move away as soon as you can. For folks like me and my friends, who absolutely love all things spine-chilling, it generally makes for a pretty good time. Our Halloween parties are awesome. Most of our drinking nights have some sort of spooky game interwoven into them. And if you have literally nothing to do on a Friday night with your friends, you can always go on a tour of some of our haunted locals. Graveyards, abandoned buildings, creepy, forests, you name it. So, with that background established, let's cut back to tonight. Me and my closest 3 friends decided to try our hand at using a Ouija board. Were we going to be normal and try the Ouija board in one of our family attics? Nah, too basics. We instead decided to trek up together to, what I shit you not, an abandoned treehouse left in an elevated section of our city, surrounded by forests. What could go wrong, right? We climbed up to the treehouse, set down a spooky-themed rug, lit some candles, and brought out the Ouija board. Despite my pretty extensive resume of dealing with all things creepy, I'd never actually tried a Ouija board before, so I was really excited to see what would happen. We went into this excited to break every rule in the book. We weren't going to do a seance. We were going to ask whatever we wanted, and we didn't need to worry about being respectful to the spirit, etc. We figured if something interesting were to happen, it'd be more likely if we went in as carefree as possible. We sat in a circle around the Ouija board and got started, asking the simple question, is there a spirit with us? With all of our hands placed on the planchette. No real response. We fluttered the planchette in a few different directions, but we could tell we were kind of forcing it. We asked a few other questions. What is your name? When did you die? Etc. But nothing really came of it. After trying for the next half hour and not really getting anything in the form of a response, we decided that we probably didn't have any spooky luck tonight and opted instead to share scary stories in the treehouse. We left the Ouija board out, just in case we'd get luckier later in the night. Amidst a break in our storytelling where everyone was grabbing drinks and snacks from their bags, I decided to give the Ouija board another quick go. I placed my hand on the planchette alone and whispered the following question. Will you please grace us with your presence tonight? Surprisingly, the planchette started moving. It's hard to explain, but you kind of know when something is moving on its own versus when you sort of subtly and subconsciously move it with your hand to force an answer. This felt real. A tingle went up my spine. It was cool as hell. My hand was moved to the following letters. Yes. Awesome. I looked over to the group and told them that the Ouija board was working again. Excitedly, we all huddled around and placed our hands on the planchette. I followed up with another question. Where are you from? We sat there excitedly, waiting for something instead. Nothing. The planchette was still there. The lack of any sort of external force with us was very, very obvious. It was disappointing, but I had an idea I wanted to follow up with. I turned to my friend Kevin and asked him, do you want to try doing it solo? It worked for me. Kevin was confused, but he decided to give it a try. We all backed up to give him some space with the Ouija board. He placed his hand on the planchette and repeated my question. Where are you from? His expression changed to shock as his hand started moving with the planchette. He turned to all of us and mouthed, I'm not doing this. To which I excitedly mouthed back, I know. I pulled out a notepad and recorded the answer as the planchette went from letter to letter. I recorded the following. Not important. Love it. A spirit with some sass. I asked Kev to back up for a sec as I approached the Ouija board, preparing for one final solo question. I asked, "Why are you only responding when one of us is using the board?" Yet again, the planchette moved effortlessly with my hand. It was faster this time, so I said the letters out loud and had another one of my friends, Eleonora, transcribe them onto my notepad. The answer was, "One at time." Fair enough, I thanked the spirit, my hand still on the planchette. "I appreciate your answers, friend." To my surprise, in a strange synergy between me and the spirit, I felt compelled to move the planchette again. It was the fastest it had ever been this time, as it covered the following letters. "Tell everyone else to leave." My friends looked at me skeptically as I said the letters one at a time. "Are you sure you didn't just force that on purpose?" asked Eleonora, and I assured her I definitely didn't. That was definitely from the spirit. At this point, this had been the most clearly supernatural phenomenon I'd ever experienced in my life, and I was excited to keep it going. My friends, usually unflinching and made of ice, were a little bit thrown. Eleonora and Martin looked ever so slightly spooked, but Kev was willing to go with it. Might as well see where this goes, Kev said as he started climbing down from the treehouse. With a slight bit of hesitation, Eleanor and Martin followed suit. Sweet. It was actually a creepy night. I embraced the quiet amidst the lighting of the candles and the power of the Ouija board. I geared up for my next question. I wasn't going to hold back. "Spirit, how will I die?" I took a deep breath, waiting for some movement. Slowly. "Depends." Interesting answer, if not a bit underwhelming. I geared up for my follow-up. "Oh, come on, Spirit. What about something a bit more specific?" My hand moved with the planchette to the following letters. I tried hard to focus and connect the letters since I didn't have anyone to transcribe with me. "What is your name?" Weird. She completely dodged my question and asked me my name. Okay, all-knowing spirit. I assumed you'd already know that. I decided to try tricking it. "My name is Belle." Movement from the planchette on the Ouija board. It took me to the letters. "Do not lie." Well played. Spirit. I gave the spirit my actual name, Jennifer, and continued to see the follow-up response. "What is your favorite food?" Honoring the spirit's rules, I opted to tell the truth instead of following up with another lie. Your girl loves donair, and this spirit deserves to know that. The Ouija board's response. Correct? Before I could take in the affirmation from the spirit, who is asking who questions here, spirit, it followed up with yet another question. What is your biggest fear? And don't lie. This question took me a bit aback. I wasn't really afraid of anything, or so I thought, so I struggled with it. It took me a few moments. I really thought of it. I kind of cringed at the answer. But it was my truth. Something horrible is happening to my little brother. There was no movement from the Ouija board. Seconds turned into minutes as I kept my hand awkwardly placed on the planchette. Then, finally, "Thank you. Send Eleonora." Well, I obliged. I thanked the spirit for its time and decided to climb down from the treehouse, where my friends were waiting. I passed on the spirit's message and told Eleonora that it was her turn. Martin, Kev, and I spent what must have been 15 minutes standing outside the treehouse while Eleonora was up there. We'd pulled drinks out of our bags and were discussing my experience with the Ouija board so far. Both were incredibly surprised when I told them the spirit was asking me questions. What kinds of questions? Generic stuff, like my name, favorite food, etc., I answered. Weird. Both Kev and Martin seemed a bit thrown off by it, but I was excited. We looked up at the treehouse as we heard the sounds of someone climbing down. Eleonora had finished her session. She looked traumatized. "How was it?" I asked her. "Weird. All it did was ask me questions." Questions like, Kevin asked her, my name, my favorite hobby, my biggest fear. That one took me a while to answer. Kev turned to me. "That is a little bit eerie," he said. I agreed. It didn't look like Eleonora was loving it either. But still, is there a spirit asking us questions? This had been one of the coolest, if not the coolest, paranormal experiences I'd ever experienced in my life. Eleonora turned to Martin. "It said that you were up next." Martin's session seemed longer than the others. We stood outside, drinking, talking about the happenings so far and pulling out the occasional snack. "That was a little bit traumatizing," said Eleonora. Kevin pointed to her and then up to the treehouse. "Agreed. This is kind of messed up," he said. "Yeah, but that's the point," I responded. "We seek out spooky happenings all the time, and we never get lucky. This is an actual, legit, supernatural experience. I feel like we have to take advantage of it. Even if it's asking us personal stuff. What does it want this information for?" Followed up with Eleonora. I shrugged. While the biggest fear question was pretty weird, I didn't feel too worried that a spirit knew what my favorite food was or what my name was. Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of someone climbing down from the treehouse. Martin had finished up his session. It felt like it had been 30 minutes, which topped the rest of our sessions. We bombarded Martin with questions as he reached the ground. He looked more shell-shocked than Eleonora did. "That was pretty fucked up," he started. "What did it ask you?" I asked enthusiastically. "My biggest fear," Martin responded. "It's weird, but it felt like it didn't like my answer to that one. It almost seemed annoyed." "Huh. So was it just silent for a while after that?" I asked. "No. It asked me way more things after that. What the happiest moment of my life was, who I was the most jealous of, what my biggest life dream was, all that stuff. There were a lot of questions. Then finally, it just wrapped up with thank you, and that was that." Martin turned to Kevin. "You're up next." Kevin turned to all of us and said, "Here goes nothing." He sighed and started climbing up to the treehouse. We watched him make his way to the top. For the first time in the evening, I had a knot in my stomach. Only 5 minutes had passed since Kevin first went up, but he was already climbing down. He was shaking his head as he made his way down the ladder and to our group. "Fuck that," said Kevin. "What happened?" we asked him. He just shook his head. "That shit is dangerous. We need to get the fuck out of here ASAP." I'd never seen Kevin like this. He was uncharacteristically shaken. "You have to tell us more. What did it ask you? What did it say?" But Kevin ignored all of our questions. He started packing up his bag. "You guys can play with fire if you want, but I'm out of here. I suggest you guys come too," he said. I watched as Martin and Eleonora started packing up as well. "I had bad feelings throughout this whole thing. I think we should leave," said Martin. "Guys, what the hell? Just because it's unsettling doesn't mean we have to pack up. We can just hang out up there and do something else," I said back. "This doesn't feel right," said Eleanor. I watched them as they all took a few steps away from the treehouse and towards the forest. "You coming?" asked Kevin. I stood my ground. "Suit yourself." I had no idea what could have possibly happened up there that would have shook him this much. He had already started walking as Martin and Eleonora pleaded with me to come with them. I said no. Begrudgingly, they all left. You're probably wondering, wasn't I scared, especially now that I'm alone? The answer was yes, but something in my soul told me that I was up next. I'd spent my whole life waiting for something that was truly supernatural to happen. And now it was in front of me. With my fingers jittering, I climbed up to the treehouse as my friends departed. It took me a moment to pull together the courage to put my hand on the planchette. The candles were still lit. The setting was just right. Finally, I spoke to the spirit again. "Why are you asking us all these questions?" Nothing for a few minutes. Then my hand moved with the planchette, slower than usual. The answer: to confirm my suggestions. Confirm your suspicions of what? Movement from the planchette on the Ouija board. One of you is not who you say you are. What are you talking about? I heard blood-curdling shrieks coming from the forest outside the treehouse, like nothing I'd ever heard before. What the fuck? The planchette was moving on its own now. I watched it go from letter to letter. That is not Kevin. He is coming back for you. Run. And so I did. The small section of the city I live in is generally known to be haunted. I think I know why. It's time for me to leave. I live on the streets. When they meet me, people wonder why. I've made up all sorts of lies and occasionally told the truth. Even rarer, somebody believes me. I finally decided to set it down in writing, to record it for after I pass it on, and so that I don't have to repeat the story. Next time somebody asks, they can simply read this. Most people just walk past a homeless person. Some will give spare change. That's rarer these days, with fewer people carrying cash. But there are enough kind people willing to go into shops for me that I get by. Barely. And even more rarely, somebody will stop to talk to me. Most homeless people I know don't ask. We've all experienced trauma of some kind, and we generally don't like to talk about it. My story is unusual though. I'm very articulate, and I'm fluent in English, French, Mandarin, German, and Yoruba with a decent understanding of Swedish, Korean, and Swahili. I'm also very good at talking my way out of situations and persuading people to find common ground. With all these skills, people who talk to me ask, why aren't I? For example, a well-paid translator or diplomat. The answer is simple, because those jobs take place indoors. For the last 7 years, I've lived on the streets of a city in West Africa. I won't name it. I get by on the charity of others and doing gardening jobs and a bit of bricklaying. In the early stages of construction, at least. I have to bail on those jobs when houses are nearing completion, as you'll see. But I grew up in northern England. My parents are fairly wealthy, and I attended a private school, not one you'll likely have heard of. But my education was excellent. My life was going very well. I had plenty of friends, and I was getting good grades in science, French, and Latin. I had won a few minor piano competitions and enjoyed skiing holidays in Switzerland most years. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm boasting. That's not my intention. I'm just presenting my life as it was, so that you fully appreciate the contrast and understand that I had no reason to run from it. You see, just after my 13th birthday, after school on a Friday in June, I was supposed to meet some friends in a coffee shop in town. I was there first and feeling very grown up and wanting to show off when they arrived. I ordered a latte. So there I was, sitting alone with my coffee, scrolling through Twitter when a woman approached me. She was 40, maybe 50 years old, with long dark hair, and wore what looked like it would have been a very nice business suit 10 years earlier. Now it was ragged, with holes and dark stains. She sat herself down opposite me and stared at me. I tried to ignore her at first. After a minute or so, I looked up and, with an annoyed tone, asked, "Yeah, what do you want?" Her response was just 3 words. "I'm so sorry." And then she reached over and touched my hand, stood up, and walked away. I'd never seen her before, and I haven't seen her again since. This, of course, puzzled me. She probably had me confused with somebody else, I told myself. It was a weird encounter, sure, but it was over, and it was at least a good story to tell my friends. Whenever they turned up, I was probably a bit more rattled than I admitted to myself, and I had another sip of my coffee and stood up to go to the toilet. 10 meters walked to the toilet, and that was the last time I was ever in England. I pushed open the toilet door, walked through, and was hit in the face by freezing snow. I don't know where I was back then. In shock, I turned around to go back through the door, but there was no door there. Instead, I was in a field of white. It took me a moment to realize that it was a snowstorm and that I was outside. I don't think I panicked. I didn't understand what had happened or how, but I calmly assessed the situation. I was outside in the cold and the snow, wearing my summer school uniform, warts and all, with no idea where the nearest shelter was. I could figure out what had happened later. For now, I needed to survive. Looking around, visibility was not as bad as I'd feared. It was daytime. The snow was falling straight down rather than the storm I'd assumed at first, and I could make out a neat line of trees in the distance. That probably meant a road, and a road meant civilization. So off I headed, across what seemed to be a farmer's field, and in 5 minutes I was indeed on a road. There were no signs that I could make out, so I picked a direction at random and started walking. After about half an hour, I saw a light in the distance. I'd been shivering for some time, but I felt alert, so I didn't think I was at immediate risk of hypothermia. I kept going and soon arrived at a small cottage with lights on in the downstairs windows. A man answered my earnest knocks on the front door. He spoke a few words in a language I didn't know, and I pushed into the house, wanting to get out of the cold before explaining myself. And then I was on a beach. It took a moment to get over the shock of the sweltering heat. I blinked in the bright midday sun and looked around as my eyes started to adjust. I heard the sounds of people splashing in the water and generally having fun. Tout vas bien. Tout vas bien? A dark-skinned man in shorts and a t-shirt was running towards me, asking if I was okay. I suppose I looked quite bewildered and out of place, and I was probably the only person nearby still shivering, still confused, but relieved that he spoke French, a language I understood fairly well. I looked at him and tried to explain what was happening, but truthfully, I didn't know what was happening, and truthfully, I didn't know what was happening, and I just stared at him dumbstruck. He introduced himself as Louis. I managed to stammer out, "Where am I?" To which he replied that I was on a beach near Port-au-Prince. With me still barely able to articulate myself, Louis offered his help. He asked where my parents were, and when I couldn't answer, he led me to his car, saying that he could drive me to his house and we could figure things out from there. I've since learned that this was a very unwise move. Port-au-Prince in Haiti is one of the most crime-ridden cities on the planet. Murders and kidnappings are common, and there is a good chance Louis intended to traffic me, but I didn't realize that at the time, and I certainly wasn't thinking straight. I followed Louis up the beach, where he led me to a small car and opened the passenger door for me. I climbed into the car and fell quite hard onto the tarmac of a town in the early evening. Now bear in mind that I was 13 years old at the time. In the span of about 2 hours, I'd been accosted by a strange woman, trekked through snow in my shorts, led up a sweltering beach by a stranger, and to top it off, I now had a severely bruised behind. So I think my response to these events was entirely reasonable, given the circumstances. I cried. I looked around, found an out-of-the-way alleyway, hid myself behind some bins, and cried myself to sleep. Somebody woke me up by talking loudly. I opened my eyes to see 2 police officers, a white man and a white woman, standing over me. I knew German only enough to identify the language, not to understand what they were saying, but as I stood up in the chill of the early morning, I suppose they saw my school uniform, and the woman started speaking English. Apparently somebody had seen me there. A child sleeping rough. The policewoman was very kind. She asked a lot of questions. Had I lost my school tour group? Where was I staying? Did I know my parents' phone number? I mumbled half answers to her questions, and her colleague motioned behind them to the police car I now saw at the end of the alleyway. It was only now that I realized what was happening. Doors were cursed, for me at least. If I tried to get into the police car, who knows where I would end up? For a split second, I considered trying to explain things to them before settling on. Again, the only reasonable course of action. It's hard to run from the police, especially when they know the city and you don't. But I was still quite small, and I got lucky. I ran down the alley, turned left into a smaller alley, and saw a chain link fence a short distance along. A hole had been torn through the bottom, probably by somebody doing something just like me, and I dived down and crawled through. My school blazer caught on the fence, and I struggled to escape. The police had almost caught me by the time I managed to wriggle out of it, and I ran off, leaving my blazer behind. Good riddance, I thought. It made me far too identifiable anyway. I ran for maybe half an hour, ripping my tie off, now just dressed in gray shorts and a white shirt. I looked a bit less like an English schoolboy. It was Saturday, and I was just another German kid out looking for his friends. Germans don't go to school on Saturday mornings, right? I wondered. Whatever the case, I didn't find any more trouble that morning. I still had sturdy for coffee and shopping, and I followed the crowd until I found a small street market. One stall owner was happy to take my sturdy for a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and a plain jumper, and give me 10 euros to buy a small lunch. I'm sure I was ripped off, but I didn't really feel I had much choice. To answer the police's question, no, I didn't know my parents' numbers, and my phone was out of charge anyway. I needed a plan. I walked around town, which I learned was called Passau, and found an out-of-the-way bridge near the river. I decided to stay here, at least this evening. It was still early, but I was exhausted and just needed to rest. After the insanity of only, I realized, 24 hours. It was getting dark when I was aroused from dozing. I was sitting against a wall in a 90-degree corner when somebody found me, after a similar exchange to the one I'd had that morning. He spoke in broken English. Victor was 16 and had been on the streets of Passau for about a month. His mom had left years before, and his dad had kicked him out of his home when he found out Victor was gay. I hadn't realized that sort of thing still happened. I suppose I had led a sheltered life up until that point. Victor was bigger than me and knew the city. He hadn't lived on the streets that long, but he was far more streetwise than I was, and he showed me how to survive. Over the next few months, I learned where to steal food, where to beg, where the driest shelters were, and even how to pickpocket. Passau has a small homeless community, but a close one, and I got to know some people very well. It's fair to say that by the time my 14th birthday rolled around, I was much more aware and capable. I learned German and practiced my French with a fellow migrant. I learned how to repair clothes and how to haggle with street vendors. I was still small for my age, and I found that I could wriggle into and hide in very tight spaces. In short, I proved myself to be useful to the homeless community of Passau. It was useful enough that others were very happy to indulge my little eccentricities and would go into shops for me when I needed to buy something. I got blankets and a sleeping bag for winter, and Victor would even charge my phone for me in coffee shops and pubs. It wasn't the life I was used to, but it wasn't the life, and I had companionship. This all changed after I'd been in Germany for just over a year. It was early evening, about an hour before kickoff at the European Championship final. Germany was about to play Spain, and there were plenty of people in the pubs getting drunk. Easy pickings for a thief. Victor and I had been working together for a year, and we carried out our well-rehearsed routine. We hung around a busy street until I saw two men come out of a pub, one of them putting his wallet in his back pocket as he left. Perfect. I signaled to Victor and started walking behind them. After a few moments, Victor bumped into him from the side, giving me the opportunity to lift his wallet. but his friend had turned his head to look behind him at just the wrong moment. He shouted, and the two of them turned to me. I ran, and Victor ran the other way, but the two men ignored him. I had a head start and thought I could outrun them. But one was gaining on me. In a split second, I decided that it would be easier to hide in a crowd and ran for the door of the packed pub the two men had just left. I pushed the door open and hurtled through it. I arrived in Nanjing at night. Of course, I didn't know this at the time, but it was a fairly busy street, and I saw the Chinese characters on street signs. I won't go into a blow-by-blow account of my time there, which lasted about a year and a half, but in many respects, it was similar to my time in Germany. In a way, I was getting used to this. Living on the streets is more or less the same in any country. Nanjing is a much larger city than Passau, and quite prosperous, but every city has its downs and outs. I sought out the homeless, and while it took me a while longer than in Germany, I learned the language and culture of the place. If you Google it, you might think Nanjing is pretty safe. For the most part, that's true, but sleeping on the street is no safer there than anywhere else. I found safety in a street gang, putting the skills I'd learned in petty theft and pickpocketing to use. People come and go on the streets, but I ran with a group of 5 or 6 younger people while I was there, even having a bit of a thing with Yaihan, a girl a couple of years older than me. We would do what we called hit and run. We'd all chase somebody out alone, steal their wallet, and run in different directions. The others met up in an abandoned warehouse some way out from the center of town, and they got used to my weird insistence on staying outside and sleeping elsewhere. Nanjing has a heavier police presence than Passau, but my colleagues knew where they didn't go, and I did quite well, until one night in March. We were stalking a couple of drunk men in their 30s, and were about to make our practice move, when another group arrived to do the same. I saw the situation developing and signaled for my people to move out. Our competitors followed us down a side street. They clearly wanted a fight, and 2 of my friends did as well. I was happy to call it a night, and managed to talk them down from a confrontation when Yai Chen, who was always a bit trigger-happy, threw a punch at one of the others. 3 of them pulled knives from their coats. One stabbed Ai Chen in the gut, and the others went for the rest of us. I ran. I was the fastest in our gang, but one of them was faster than me, and he nearly caught me. Seeing no other option, I legged it towards the main street and made my way to a shop. The staff were just closing up, but I didn't need to get in there. I just needed to pass the threshold. I made it through the door. This time, I landed in Sweden, in the middle of the countryside. It was early afternoon and sunny, so I walked until I found a road and followed signs to Gothenburg. That was 15 kilometers, and a few drivers offered me a lift along the way, though obviously I declined. I was, in a way, starting to feel quite confident now. I'd relocated twice, and felt that I knew what to do. Sweden is a nice place, even for the homeless, especially if you're young and white. Strangers were generally kind, and I did well there. However, it can get very cold on the streets in winter, and when snow started to fall, I realized I wasn't likely to survive until spring. So in November, for the first time, voluntarily, I walked through a shop door and into another country. It didn't help. In the mild first snow of a Swedish winter, I arrived in a forest in freezing temperatures. I'd gone from mid-afternoon in Sweden to the evening, so I guessed I was somewhere in Russia, but I couldn't stay. After looking around for a bit, I couldn't find any sign of civilization, so I decided to test my curse. Did that woman, 3 years earlier, curse me? She seemed strange, but not unkind. Perhaps she simply realized before I did that I'd been cursed by someone or something else. I didn't know. Not back then. I knew a bit about how it worked. I collected some fallen logs and branches, and over about an hour, I built a rectangular frame, a doorway. I stepped through. Nothing happened. I arrived on the other side of the doorway. Okay, so that didn't work. Maybe it needed an actual door. I could hardly build hinges in the forest, even if I knew how. So instead, I gathered some vines and leaves and strung them into a hanging door from the top of the frame, like a beaded curtain. Honestly, I was quite proud of my handiwork. For a first attempt with no tools, I was very impressed and almost reluctant to test it, but it was cold and dark and it was starting to rain, so I stepped through it. It worked, and my next stop was Kenya. I found myself in the countryside on a warm evening on a farm. I judged that it was a long way to a city, and I learned later that I was correct. So I decided to introduce myself to the farmers. They spoke barely any English, and I didn't yet speak any Swahili, but I managed to persuade the family that ran the farm to let me work for them. I'm sure they didn't really understand my motivations. A posh white English boy asking only for food in exchange for his labor, choosing to sleep outside. They were friendly and happy with the arrangement. Over the next 2 years, I learned how the farm worked, built up my muscles. I'm still small and wiry, strong, and proved myself to be an able worker. I picked coffee beans, milked cows, fixed fences, and acquired a decent tan. I even occasionally made the journey to a nearby market town, sitting in the back of one of the flatbed trucks. I was certainly a curiosity to the locals, but I was treated well. I would happily have stayed on that Kenyan farm for life. But after 2 years, something happened. The father of the household was off at the market town, and the rest of us were working the fields. I was bringing several baskets of coffee beans to the barn, and I heard shouting. Saya, help, help, help. The mother of the household, Anissa, had fallen in the kitchen. From the outside, I could tell that her leg was bad. It was bleeding severely, and I think I could see bones sticking out. It was rare that there was just one person in the farmhouse, but it did happen. The closest help was probably at least 10 minutes away, and Anissa was bleeding too fast. I was the only one who could help, but somehow I needed to get in there. Obviously, the door was out of the question, but the kitchen window was wide open. Were windows safe? The answer, it turned out, was no. I hope Anissa got the help she needed, though I doubt it. But the last I saw of her as I swung a leg into the kitchen was an expression of abject terror, and then she and the farmhouse disappeared, replaced in an instant by the nighttime streets of Seoul. Again, I had to start over, and again, I had to learn a new language. English isn't well spoken in Korea, and it took me some time before I could get on. I made a few friends and supported myself largely by stealing and pickpocketing. Without the kind of network I'd built up in Germany and China, things were more difficult. I got caught a few times and escaped before anything serious happened. Until after about a year, I guessed that the police had had a few reports of street thefts in my area. I noticed an increased police presence, and one day I just got sloppy. A couple was having coffee outside a cafe at lunchtime. The man's wallet was on the table between them, and I was hungry. I pulled my hoodie over my face, ran, and grabbed the wallet. While I was running away, I pulled the cash out, throwing the wallet on the ground. Then, 10 minutes later, the police found me. I'd found another cafe with outdoor service. It wasn't far enough away, and I guess I hadn't hidden my face as well as I thought. I wasn't in a tourist area, and it was pretty easy to identify the only white man around, especially as I was wearing the same clothes. I saw 2 policemen walking towards me and started to run, but this time they were faster. They tackled me to the ground and bundled me into their patrol car. It was dark. It's too dark to see anything. At first, I assumed I was on the other side of the world at night, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was underground. I was in a vast cavern. There was minimal light, coming from a few burning torches in the distance. The ground was rough but solid, and the air was chilly, but no colder than the average night on the street in most towns. I could make out very little at first, and I decided to head toward the torches while I figured out what my new situation was. As I got closer, I realized the torches surrounded a pit, and I could make out people under the torches. Some of them looked up as I approached, but they didn't say anything. All were inside the pit, which I could now see covered a rough square, maybe 30 meters to the side. And then I heard something else, a kind of chittering. To the side, I saw creatures. Not human, nor like any animal I've ever seen before. They were about a meter tall and walked on 4 chitinous legs with 2 arms in front of them. Their bodies were black and glossy, and their heads had large jaws and mandibles. In science class years ago, we had a few stag beetles in a fish tank, and these creatures reminded me of those. The beetles came towards me. There were 6 of them, and while they were smaller than me, they quickly overpowered me, all the while making horrific clicking and chittering sounds. They took me to the edge of the pit. 2 more beetles standing there pushed a long wooden ramp down into the pit, and the others pushed me down it and then took the ramp back up. I was stuck, or so it seemed. The walls were too high and smooth to easily climb, and I now noticed several more beetles standing guard at intervals along the wall. Even if I got out, I had no idea where I was or what kind of problem I'd found myself in at this time. The humans I was with numbered about 50, quite diverse, but young. There were teenagers and people in their 20s, but no older. At 19, I was pretty much in the middle, age-wise. A woman approached me and started speaking French. Great. At least I could understand her. It's impossible to tell time down in that underground cavern, but I gathered it was about the start of their effective nighttime. The woman, who introduced herself as a Parisian named Josie, explained that the beetles used them for labor and other things, although she refused to elaborate on what other things meant. They kept them fed, made them work for half the day, but otherwise more or less left them alone. Josie introduced me to the others, showed me the food, almost exclusively berries and mushrooms, and told me to fill my belly and rest as well as I could, as I would be put to hard work the next day. She was right. The next day, I was woken by a human, Carl, shaking me. The beetles had already set up the ramp and were bringing us up in groups of 4. I had no intention of being used as a slave, but I decided against taking action until I'd figured things out a bit more. My group was led down a maze of tunnels for about 20 minutes until we arrived at a broader cave, though much smaller than the main cavern. One of the beetles held a flat piece of slate on which they had drawn a chalk diagram. They may not be able to speak human languages, but they can hold things with their front limbs and draw. It pointed to each of us in turn, then to a part of the drawing, then to an area of the cave. Jerome, a dark-skinned man from Senegal, explained what I'd already figured out. The beetles wanted us to excavate the cave, according to the plan on the slate. There were some crude pickaxes and other tools already in the cave. I looked at the sharp, heavy tools and at the 2 small beetles. Jerome mouthed no at me. I learned later that people have tried that before, and they always ended up dead. The creatures were stronger than they looked. So I got to work pickaxing and chiseling out a room for the insects. After maybe an hour, the beetles left. Sandy, a Canadian girl of 15, told me that while we could speak freely, the tunnels were maze-like. She had run once, but if there was anywhere to go, she hadn't found it. The beetles had left a few torches for us to work by, but they had much better night vision than we did, and while we would get lost in the tunnels, they could seemingly make their way just fine in complete darkness. I think insects lay trails using pheromones as well, so they don't even need to see in the tunnels. And so it continued for a long time. I carved out cave rooms, made what I believe was insect furniture. I still don't know where they got the wood, and even worked a forge. We marked our days, by our rest periods, and long ago, somebody had started scratching lines into the wall of the pit to mark each day. As had become tradition, I scratched my name above the day I arrived. This was day 11,408 since the calendar had started, 1 year earlier. We spent our evenings telling stories. True stories of our lives outside, stories we could remember reading. and stories we made up ourselves during the long working days. I suggested singing once, but was shot down immediately. Apparently, the Beatles really didn't like human song. Just like living on the streets, people come and go. Haruki, a Japanese man, was crushed by a falling rock in an excavation. I wasn't in the same group, but I heard the screams echoing through the corridors. In accordance with our tradition, we scratched his name below the line for that day. Arrivals are marked above, and departures, as we euphemistically call deaths, are below the timeline. Jason appeared after a few months, followed shortly by Luez, in much the same way as I had. And then Caroline, a 16-year-old girl from Mexico, lost it when we were being corralled into the pit at the end of the day. Everybody can snap if they're pushed too far, and as she reached the ramp, Caroline screamed and shouted, then ran into the darkness. Some of the insects followed her, and this was when I learned how fast they can move. They caught up with Caroline after only a few seconds and dragged her to the edge of the pit, pinning her down until the rest of us were all in there, and they had pulled up the ramp. More beetles had arrived, and then, in full view of us all, they ripped her apart. Her flesh tore as mandibles slashed into her body. I watched, incapable of help but unable to look away, as she screamed in agony until her windpipe was severed, and then they started to eat her. It took about 10 minutes in all, and at the end of it, there was nothing left. There was no sign that anything had happened, except for the blood that trickled down the wall of the pit. We saw and heard it all. The rending of flesh, the crunching of bone, the chittering of the insects, in what I can only interpret as excitement. When they were finished, the beetles stood on the wall, looked down at us, and walked away like nothing had happened. We were in shock, of course. There were no stories told that evening. In fact, nobody spoke as Carl scratched Caroline below the mark for that day. We went to sleep in silence, though I don't know if any of us actually slept that night. I certainly didn't. The next day continued as normal. We worked in subdued silence. We returned to the pit. We ate our meager meal of berries and fungi. I was the first to speak. My life down there wasn't great, but it was something I could get on with, something in which I could find a certain level of contentment. Not any longer. So for the first time, I asked about the doors. Most of my fellows hadn't properly realized that doors were the trigger. It seemed I was the only one who had traveled anywhere else. The underground realm was the first and only trip any of the others had made. Simon, a fellow Englishman, told us that he had once taken some items to the creatures' homes. They lived in carved caves, presumably mined out by previous generations of human captives, and while he didn't understand their culture, they clearly had decorations. While there, he saw a large slate with a chalk face drawn on it. A human face, one that he didn't recognize, until Jenny arrived a few days later. He hadn't mentioned this at the time, but it helped me start to put the pieces together, I think. I don't understand my curse, but I believe the creatures marked me. The other humans in that place hadn't traveled around like I did. Their first trip through a door took them to the underground. I think the woman in the coffee shop recognized that I was marked and tried to help. I think when she touched me, she disrupted the curse, randomizing my destination. And I thought back to the time I tried to help Anissa, back in the Kenyan farmhouse, and the look on her face as I portaled away. I wonder what she saw as I disappeared. This was interesting, but it didn't really help us. Then I talked about my travels, how any door or even window acted as a portal. I had created my own, and it didn't work until I put a door into the doorway, and gradually we formed a plan. Most of the floor of the pit was made of smooth stone, but there was a small area of earth, a couple of meters wide. Our captors rarely came down into the pit. They threw food down from above. We carried waste out in buckets, and they didn't need to come down to bring us up, as they would simply withhold food if we refused, as Jerome recalled from years earlier. It was a simple plan, but a slow one. Over the next few months, we smuggled tiny bits of stone, wood, and whatever else we could hide on our person. First, we build a wooden board, just small enough to cover the soil. One person would dig out soil from below the board while the rest of us kept watch. The beetles have small eyes, and although their night vision is excellent, I don't think they can see very well at a distance, relying more on smell. So if we were careful, we could work without being noticed. And we were careful. If we were caught at any stage of the plan, it would be game over. We worked for less than an hour each night, covering the hole with the board and hiding the board with soil. Extracted earth went little by little into our waste buckets. After some time, we hit solid rock, but the hole was now about 1.5 meters deep. It was enough. Phase 2 of the plan was riskier. Carving into the solid sections of the wood with sharp rocks made a sound a lot like the beetle's speech, and we knew they had good hearing. We only dared do a tiny bit each night, but eventually we had a frame and a door. All we needed now was a hinge. Slowly, we scraped out 3 holes along one side of the door and tied it to the frame with some braided roots we had gathered from the caves. It was done. I doubted it would hold together for long, but it didn't need to. We held quiet celebration, as much as we could down there, and Louise carved a final message at the end of the timeline. Fuck you. Sandy volunteered to be the first to test it. For all 50 of us to make it, we would need to move fast, and this is why we had decided to use a trapdoor. It would be quicker to jump down, one after another, than to wriggle horizontally through a doorway that size. We checked the surroundings, and seeing only a couple of beetles not paying much attention to us, we decided on our order. I was number 14. Sandy carefully uncovered the trapdoor, opened it, and jumped down, and disappeared. It worked, trying to contain our excitement. We followed through in our agreed order. As number 11 jumped in, I heard chittering from above. They had noticed something, but we could do nothing about that. We kept filing in until I jumped down. This is when I arrived in Western Africa, where I've lived for the last 7 years, and where I hope to live for the rest of my natural life. 13 others had entered the portal before me, but they were nowhere to be seen. I hope that they're living safely elsewhere, away from the clutches of those monstrous slavers. I pray every night that those behind me in the line got away before the creatures reached them, but I haven't heard from them. I'm not sure how I could unless one of you is reading this. I still don't know how that woman in the coffee shop knew about me. Perhaps she herself had been there, in that cave or another one, and escaped. It would make sense, given the state of her clothes. Or maybe she's something else. A psychic, perhaps. She could walk through doors, and maybe I can now too. Maybe when I left the underground realm, the curse was broken, but I don't dare risk it. Maybe one day, I'll see somebody else who is marked and recognize them. I could hardly warn them of the danger. Nobody would believe me, but I can touch their skin and disrupt the curse. I've escaped, but the insect things are still there, and who knows how many other colonies they have. It's hard to get exact figures, but in the USA alone, 6,000 people a year go missing and are never found. How many of them are trapped underground, enslaved by a species that regards humans as nothing more than a source of labor and food?